Thanks, guys. So for those of you who weren't in my last session, I'll just say a little bit about who I am. So if you were in my last session, then eat some jelly beans and just, because you'll have heard this before. But I'm obviously not the Prince William version of myself, or the Prince William attached version of myself. I am also not pregnant, unlike her, which I'm enjoying very much, not being pregnant. That's good. And the discussion about, at least it's not discussion about the quality of my hairstyle that I'm reading in the papers. It's more just like how her bump's growing. So that's good. That's good. My daughter gets teased a lot more about the Kate Middleton thing than I do, bless her. So she's very hopeful that their next child will be both a girl and named Leah, because she would like for once to be the famous one in our family. But we'll see how that goes. I don't think there's that. Well, though she says there is a Princess Leah, or Leia, so she thinks the precedent has been set, she reckons. But we'll see. Anyway. Actually who I really am, I'm a psychologist by background and by training, but I'm also a church leader. I work with a church in Hertfordshire. At the moment, I'm doing a kind of crazy commute because my husband decided to spend 2 years in Paris, so that's where we're living. But I'm still working in the UK, so that's just slightly weird, but don't worry, it does work. Don't worry about how it just does. We're coming back this summer, so I won't have to explain that anymore after that. So I work with the church in Hertfordshire. I also work with Mind and Soul. I'm one of the leadership there. We're a national organisation looking at the church and matters of emotional and mental health. We're about encouraging the church to engage in this stuff. We're about equipping and resourcing the church to do it well. And we're about really trying to get everybody thinking and talking about this important stuff. And what I want to talk about in this session, the last session, those of you who were and weren't here, if you weren't, you can catch up on it later, I believe. We were looking at the emotional health of children and young people. What's going on in their lives and in their brains that makes it such a turbulent time, that makes it so common for them to be struggling with emotional health issues, and what can we do to support them? This session, I want to think about that wider question of the church and emotional health, particularly looking at the pressures and the challenges that are on us, as well as the other people in our churches, and how do we manage that sort of stuff. We know, if we look at statistics for emotional and mental health problems, that they are incredibly common. 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem at some stage in their life, so that's a diagnosable mental health problem. And that statistic's one that's used a lot now. You'll all have heard it. It's been used in some publicity campaigns and stuff, and it's a really helpful statistic in terms of helping people realize how common it is. In some ways, I think it can also be an unhelpful statistic, because what it does is it still sort of sets aside the people who are struggling with mental health problems as though they're this sort of separate little group. And it's tempting to think about mental health a bit like this. Which box are you in? And to think of not just yourself, but everybody else as well as in one or other of these little boxes. So most of us are over here. We're in the sort of healthy box. And we, for whatever reason, we've had a good start in life. We've had, our upbringing was good, pretty stable. Maybe our hormones and our brains or whatever it is all, in the right places. So we're in this nice little healthy box. We're very lucky. Then there's this other box over here of people who, for whatever reason, are not so lucky, and they are unwell emotionally, and they maybe have depression or anxiety or an eating disorder, or they struggle with self-harm, there's lots of reasons why that could be. Maybe they had a rough start in life. Maybe there's something biological going on for them that's made that. But we like to think of it that there are these two very separate boxes. And every once in a while in life, something happens, and we discover that someone we thought we knew really well and was in this box, actually all the time they were in this box, and we just never realized it. Maybe they hid it really well, or maybe it just didn't become apparent, and gosh, it's a big surprise. And the reality is, there are no boxes. We are all on a line. And at one end of the line is good mental and emotional health. And most of us, most of the time, are at this end of the line, particularly if we're lucky enough to have had good starts, we've lived in good, stable backgrounds, people are around, we've had good messages about emotional health. We're mostly at this end. As we go through life, more and more of us will find that stuff happens. Stuff happens that you often never expected to happen. Challenges are thrown at you. You experience things that you never really wanted to be part of your life story. Bereavement, difficult stuff, car crashes, illness. Who knows what it's going to be? But things happen. So a lot of us will find stuff happens in life that for a period pushes us down the line. and makes it really hard, and we struggle with our emotional health. Some of us will find that becomes a long-term struggle. Some of us will just have periods where it's hard, and then the storm gets over and we're able to come back up to this end of the line again. But we all have emotional health, just like we all have physical health. If I say to you, how are you feeling today? Lots of you will say, oh, great. Some of you might say, well, actually, I've got a bit of a cold. Actually, you could say, actually, I'm struggling a bit with anxiety at the moment, because that's what emotional health is like. We're all on a continuum. At times in our lives, we will struggle more. Some of us may have physical health problems that are longer term. We might have diabetes or asthma or something like that. Makes us more prone to having problems with our physical health. Some of us have the same things with our emotional health. There are long-term issues that make it harder for us and mean that we might struggle more often. But in that way, we all have emotional health, and we need to think about it in those terms instead of in the tick box terms. Our emotional health changes as we grow as well. It's not static throughout our life. And what's interesting as Christians, as people of faith, as Jesus followers, is that we are challenged to grow throughout our life. So Paul says to the people he's teaching that they are to stop thinking like children, that they should think like mature people. We are called to change throughout our lives. We are on journeys in our lives, spiritually, mentally, experientially, but also emotionally. Things change. We are called to become mature in every respect. We are very good at thinking about our spiritual health, our spiritual maturity. We are good at thinking about what we do every day in order to remain spiritually well, and more than that, to continue to progress. We do a lot of it for our physical health these days. You know, we'll think about, are we eating our 5 a day? Did we do dry January? All of this stuff that we'll do. But what do we do for our emotional health? When was the last time you started to do something every morning or every night, or spent a month or spent Lent or whatever doing something that is all about your emotional health? We're not so good at that. And this is a quote from a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzero, whose name I always trip up over. But the sort of focus of that book is saying that we've got to get better at it, and that more as Christians, as the church, we need to get better at it. Because our job is to model stuff for the rest of the world. We're called to be ambassadors to the rest of the world. We have an understanding about life and about ourselves and our bodies and our brains and what we're here to do that a lot of people don't have. So we have a responsibility to do this stuff. And what he's saying in that book is you cannot be spiritually mature if you're still emotionally immature. The two things go together. So if you're not paying enough attention to your own emotional well-being and your own emotional maturity, you're not spiritually mature. It doesn't matter how great you know your Bible or how many years you've been in church leadership. Emotional maturity is really key. So this is what I wanted to do in this session. So the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to talk for a bit, and then I'm going to get you guys to chat in your small groups for a bit. Because this is about your experiences. And the thing about emotional health is you will all have had different experiences. But I want to raise some very specific questions today about the church specifically. How do we handle emotional health? Are there particular challenges to us as church leaders and people working in the church? I know things about you guys. I've never met most of you, but I know things about you guys just because of who you are. I know you're youth workers. I know you're passionate probably about what you do. I can guess other things about you emotionally, psychologically, by the kinds of people you are. I know you're all looking really nervous now. Don't worry, I'm not going to. But what does that tell me, therefore, about the sorts of things that you are maybe more likely to struggle with in your life? What does it tell me that you need to learn and need to be getting better at doing as you become emotionally mature? So that's what we're going to talk about. Our job in the church is to be this sort of light in the darkness. Increasingly, and I believe this really strongly, we are seeing cultural patterns that are not healthy, that are not about God's ideal for humans. They are not about God's ideal for society. They are going in a different direction. Our job is to be light in the darkness. We're also working in a community with a lot of people who are in very dark places. Maybe physically, maybe in terms of what they're experiencing socially, but also emotionally. Emotional ill health is so common. And there are people who have spent their whole lives wrestling with really dark stuff emotionally. Our job is to go in and try and bring light, to bring hope. One of the things I talk about a lot at the moment is how increasingly when you go to secular services for emotional health stuff, They've started to talk about most conditions being lifelong, and there's just an assumption that if you get this stuff, you'll always struggle with it. You know, anxiety or depression or eating disorders or whatever it is. It wasn't like that 15 years ago. I started off as a clinical medic. We used to talk about people recovering. Now we talk about helping them to manage their lifelong condition. We have to bring hope. We have to bring health. We have to bring light. Because increasingly, we are becoming different from the rest of the world in terms of the way that we see the world, the way we see people, the hope and the promise and the potential on every individual person that God created. We're going to see that in a different way, and a lot of the world isn't going to see it. What about us? I love this picture. It's very random. It's called Gravity Defying Elephant. Anyway, that probably tells you a lot about me that I like it. What I love about us is we want to push the limits. One of the things I could guess about you people is that we want to push the limits. We're passionate about what we do. And because we have this different perspective to the rest of the world, because of the Spirit of God that's in us, we want to push the limits. We believe big stuff, people. We believe they can do stuff they don't think they can do. We want to do that stuff for ourselves. But what does that mean for us as a group? Not thinking about the people we're supporting for a minute. What does it mean about us? Are we more prone to struggling with certain things ourselves in terms of our emotional health? What's the impact of that stuff on us? I read a really interesting book recently, this book called Do No Harm by a chap called Henry Marsh. He's a neuroscientist. He's a surgeon, a brain surgeon. And he's retired, and he's writing the memoirs of his life, basically. It's a very interesting book. Probably a very interesting book if you're a medic. I told my husband it was a really interesting book, and he read like a chapter and then said, it's not a really interesting book. I think it's great. I loved it. But anyway, it is a really interesting book, but I just add that little if potentially maybe not for everyone. But this is what he says at one point in the book. He says, as a surgeon, you learn at a very early stage of your career to accept intense anxiety as a normal part of the day's work and to carry on despite it. I thought that was so interesting because most of us would think that one of the amazing things about brain surgeons is that they don't get anxious. To be honest, the thought that your brain surgeon is intensely anxious might be a little bit anxiety-provoking for you. But what he's saying actually is you never get used to just the enormity of the responsibility you have. So you get used to the fact that you experience these intense emotions and you can carry on in spite of them and they don't affect you. So this is a career where he is saying that part of his challenge in his career, in his life's journey, was to learn how to deal with quite high levels of anxiety. What about us? We have a life's career that is about pushing the limits, working for the church, being really passionate, going out for God. Are there challenges to us? Is there stuff that we need to learn how to get better at handling, just like he had to get really good at handling anxiety? I wonder if there's stuff that's more common for us. I work with a lot of church leaders, and I do see patterns. And so it's going to be interesting for you guys to think about and chat about those things. I've got a book coming out. Actually, I'm not totally sure when. It probably depends on when I actually look at the proofs, because I'm always away doing things like this, and I'm not actually sitting at my desk doing these things. But soon, in the next few months, which is called Refuel. It's all about that, because I think not just as Christians, but as people in the church who are passionate, we have another challenge compared to the rest of the world. This is my experience anyway, I don't know if it's yours. But we talk about work-life balance, don't we? And in normal life, that's enough of a challenge. How do you get your work hours in and fit in the rest of your life as well? I think we have this extra challenge because we have to balance not just work and life, but also our faith and our own personal faith, but also church and what we want to do for God and the stuff we're called to do and the stuff we're passionate about. We want to get the most out of our time here for ourselves, but also for the God who we love and who we're inspired by. And because we have this role of being light in the darkness, we have this push on ourselves. Most people I work with in the church are really passionate people, and they really push the limits. And I love that. I do it myself totally. I've got like 2 or 3 jobs, 2 kids. I live in France. I work in England. It's totally nuts. On paper, it doesn't add up at all, but I absolutely love it. And I always want to be pushing those limits on things. So how do you do that without burning out? And I'm going to get you into small groups now just for 5 minutes to have a chat. 2 questions I would just want you to chat about in your groups. Do you think that people in the church are at more or less risk from issues to do with stress and burnout? And the second question is, what do you think about this whole spiritual maturity thing versus emotional maturity? What's your experience of that? Just thinking about questions like, how often do you hear teaching on emotional issues? Do you think it's something we think about in the church? Do you think it's something we tend not to? Do you think we're better or worse? And that issue of stress, burnout, what's your experience of that as an issue? Some of you will be earlier in your leadership journey in the church. Others of you have been doing this for a long time. So just grab 5 minutes in your groups, have a bit of a chat, and then we'll feed some stuff back, and then I'll talk a bit more. The first question, I'll pick it back up, hang on. Question 1. I'll flick between them periodically. Should we feed back some stuff? Anybody got anything they want to feed back? Yes. Hello.
I was kind of giving a bit of almost testimony in that November I had a brand new baby girl that came into the world, which has been great. But at the same time, I've just been appointed USEC at Winton. I'm also doing a degree with the Open Uni, and I work full time. And
Okay.
I've been really struggling with. Oh, I get emotional. No, I've been really struggling over the past couple of months with this whole brand new routine. You know,
Yeah.
ever so slightly dyslexia, I'm ever so slightly ADHD. I like my sequences and like everything's just been thrown out and it's gone mental.
Yeah.
Also, my mind's a bit like of a bubble diagram. So with new stuff with youth, I've got great new ideas, getting it down, but trying to do the simple tasks of getting it down is not easy when you've got a screaming baby.
No, I know that. I've had 2.
So like dealing with all of that at the same time, and I've started, I have been stressed. Last week I had half term, and God, me and my wife, we had some arguments last week that I almost wish actually I just went back to work because that's my escape.
Yeah, it's really hard.
It's easier, and then I feel guilty, and then it goes back to the next question about the whole, emotionally mature or spiritually mature. Now I like to think I'm spiritually mature, but emotionally I feel like I've digressed about 10 years when I was back at senior school.
Yeah, and we all go through that. By the way, when you have your first kid, it's always total bedlam. Isn't that right? Anybody not have that experience when they've had their first kid? It was in our house, so,
Sleeping like from 9 till 7, so like
if that helps a lot. But you're dead right. There are these times in life where you hit these challenges, but also you've got all this other stuff that you're really passionate about. So a lot of people, they can just drop everything else in those moments. But I think as Christians, we've got this other stuff that we want to keep doing, which puts extra pressure on us, and it's hard.
with a core like Winton that's very traditional in its setting, but at the same time it's got a big outreach program. I need to free up some time. So do I go to bandmaster saying, look, I'm going to have to come out of band? Well, I'm the only bass player, so they're stuck. Do I come out of songsters when actually I'm one of 2 tenors?
Yeah. And you sound so like so many people who I talk to from the church, because you just pack it in. When you write everything down on paper and you just think the maths of this does not even add up. You need at least a day and a half every day just to get everything in. And yet loads of people like you, probably loads of other people here, are living lives like that. And we hit periods in life where it becomes more acutely difficult. It gets easier with kids. They get less demanding. Eventually, when does that happen? Anyway, well, there's calm periods. Anyway, let's not get into that. It's hard. It is really hard. And if you want to push the limits, for me, I think a lot of people are constantly going to be on the edge, right near that risky line for where burnout is concerned. Anybody else got any particular feedback? Yes?
We didn't get onto the second question as such, but I come from, the reason I came to church about 4 or 5 years ago was I was suffering from acute anxiety, so in hearing what you're talking about, and I suppose in some ways I still do suffer without managing it. So church was, I came to church with the invite of somebody next door, and it suited me at the time through that anxiety to get a little bit of spiritual sort of solace, if you like.
Yeah.
But what happened, and just sharing here, was you suddenly get on fire for God. And being one that doesn't like to let anyone down, I say yes to absolutely everything. And before I knew it, the diary has never been so full. And come back to this guys here. You want to be in the songs, you want to do this, you want to do that.
Yeah.
You lead Bible groups, and it's only just now, after almost walking away from the church, that I've decided I now don't lead a Bible group. I now don't do this. I now do everything.
Yeah, and I think there is a particular challenge on us, isn't it? Yeah, on our emotional maturity as spirit-filled, passionate Christians to make good decisions about this stuff, which is really hard. I've been through the same phase myself, saying yes to everything and then realizing that you just can't do it. But that's part of our emotional maturity journey, definitely. Yeah. As church leaders, I would say we also have the challenge because we want to do that. We want our people to be healthy and happy and, all this stuff. At the same time, we also need people to do stuff. Like you said you're the only bass player, You're the person who needs a bass player, and you don't want to ask him, but actually I don't have anyone else to ask. So we have that challenge too. And then we have the challenge for ourselves because what we often end up doing is filling in a lot of stuff so that the other people that we are overseeing don't get burned out themselves. But at the end of the day, if we burn out, then they're going to have to pick it up. So there's a constant balance and challenge to us. I'm going to just carry on a little bit, and because I think this is really interesting that for this where you guys are at is very much where I'm at in this stuff, and I think it's interesting just to think about where this comes from, because it can sound really negative. If we carried on talking about this, what we'd all do is all start to feel quite depressed, I think, and think, oh my goodness, my time does not add up. I cannot do it all. What am I doing? I should leave the church. And people do, joking aside. I see people time and time again, people with fantastic, passionate hearts for God, who are called to do amazing things, who come to the church full of fire, and 3, 4, 5 years later they've gone. They've gone. Because they couldn't sustain that. They didn't have, or they weren't given, or we didn't disciple them and lead them well enough to help them to measure it. And so they just burnt out. And this is where I think the excitement is, because it's so great. I love so much seeing people like you guys who are passionate, you have a heart for God. I love the feel of that, the sense of God in these spaces when you come to conferences, it's just amazing. And we are called to be that. This is Paul at the beginning of Romans. We are called to take our ordinary life, and we are called to turn it into something else, something extraordinary, something amazing. Because when we give our lives to God as an offering, something amazing happens. And he takes our ordinary and turns it into something that we would never have seen as possible. We are called to be passionate, and that's why the Spirit of God does this. And you see new Christians, and they're like a car revving. You take the brake off, they're going to go really fast because they're so excited, new Christians and people in the early years of ministry, and that's wonderful. I've been in ministry for a while now, and the longer you're in it, the challenge is to keep that kind of excitement. When you see them at the beginning, it's fantastic. Paul is a guy who's very much like this. He never talks in half measures. He doesn't say like, oh, you should just kind of like people. He's like, love from the center of who you are. Everything about what you're about should be about loving other people. He's totally all or nothing. He's in this for everything. This is a verse which I think is really interesting for what we're talking about. It's from Romans 12:11. So Romans 12 is giving loads of good advice about how to live life. This is the one that starts with taking your ordinary life, placing it before God as an offering. And there's this really interesting verse. It's 12:11. This is how the NIV puts it. It says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor. Now, I don't know about you, but there's quite a lot of words in there that I don't use in my everyday life. I don't talk about zeal very much. Maybe I should. And I don't talk about fervor very much. But it's an interesting concept. So let's look at some of the other translations. This is the CEV, the Contemporary English Version. I like this. This is what they translate that verse as. Never hesitate to be enthusiastic. That's great. I love enthusiastic people, don't you? When I get in front of my church, I tell you what, I'm in a church in Paris at the moment. It's an American-run church. We have a lot of Americans. Americans are so enthusiastic. They're great. You stand up in front of them and you just say good morning. They're like, yay, amen, awesome. And you're like, oh, cool, I haven't done anything yet. They're really excited. I love enthusiasm. When I come to England, it takes a bit more to get us excited, doesn't it? I have to work a bit harder I have to say something really interesting before the English people get excited. But I love enthusiasm, and this is very of the Spirit. spirit, this passion that we're all talking about, this experience that we're sharing of wanting to push the limits. This is what Paul's talking about. I think it's something that's very much of God. This is the NLT, the New Living Translation of that verse, and it brings out this contrast. It says, never be lazy. Probably not that big a risk of any of us in this room being lazy. I don't come across that a lot in church leaders, to be honest. Generally, they're not the lazy people, but it's good to know. Never be lazy. Work hard. Serve the Lord enthusiastically. This is, again, really bringing out that sense of push the limits. Always be enthusiastic. Don't be lazy. Always go to that meeting. Always go to the late night prayer meeting. Never miss your band practice. Always lead this group. It's definitely got that sense. And then suddenly you get to this in the message. It says, don't burn out. You're like, oh, well, I didn't pick that up from the other translations. This is an interesting perspective. So now you're like, whoa, I better pull back. Actually, I better say no to all of these things because I can't risk this. And now, well, it's true, I am on the edge. All this enthusiasm, actually, I'm pretty knackered. I can't remember the last time I had a full 8 hours sleep. Because when I finished work and got the kids to bed, that's when I have to do my church stuff. And then you say, oh, gosh, well, actually, maybe I can't do any of it. It's funny. I find it interesting how the different translations bring this out. This is RSV translation. I have a friend who's a theologian, and he always says to me that I should read my RSV. He likes it. It's a good, solid grounding in terms of the version. So this is how it translates it. What I think we're seeing here is a really genuine illustration of a pull that we have on our lives. And it's two things, and it starts off with this thing, never flag in zeal. What is zeal? It's what we've been talking about. It's the thing, the drive, the energy that keeps you going. It's the fuel that drives your car. It's your passion. We mustn't ever burn out. We mustn't lose that desire to keep doing things, the ability to be energized, to have the energy and the practical things that we need in order to be able to do things. Because what we're called to do is to be aglow. This is literally about being on fire. So here we have these two pulls. We should be on fire. We should be passionate. These are all good, God-given energies, passions, drives that we have. But at the same time, we mustn't ever flag. The original word that's translated there actually can be used in this sense of being lazy. So it's saying don't be lazy. But actually, in the context that it's used here, it is much more about don't run out of energy. It's not someone who's sitting down with their feet up because they can't be bothered to do anything. It's actually more of a sense of somebody who's used all their energy and reserves, and therefore they're flagging behind. It's the same sort of context that you would use of someone who's perhaps walking and who's run out of energy, and so they've dropped back. So what they're saying is keep the pace. Don't get to a place where your energy runs out, but at the same time, you have to keep really passionate. And this is where this challenge with work-life balance comes in, where we're juggling work-life, faith, church, kids, all sorts of other stuff. And this is Paul. He's saying we shouldn't just do life, run the race. He says we should always run in such a way as to get the prize. I don't think there's a message here that says the answer is that you shouldn't be passionate. And I don't think that's of God. And actually, everything we read in the Bible is about pushing the limits, enlarging the space of our tent, reaching our potential, more and better life than we ever dreamed of, That's what the Bible is talking about. It's a very of God thing, all of those things. At the same time, though, we've got to make sure that we don't burn out. So what do you do if your desire for being all out for God is just leaving you stressed out, burned out? Because that's what I see all the time is leaders who have started with all the good intentions. And I teach whole days on this stuff for church leaders about how do we manage stress and balance it. And do you know what I come up with a lot? Is a lot of resistance from young leaders because they don't want to do less. They are so passionate, and that's such a good energy. But I know if they don't start to be mature and sensible in how they manage this stuff, the chances are if I come back to that place 5 years later, they won't be there, because they will have burned out. And a huge percentage of people who start in ministry or youth ministry or whatever it is don't last the whole race. When it comes to the end, that half the runners aren't even running anymore. I want to be still here in 10 years' time still doing this. I want to still be here in 50 years' time still doing this. Just adding up my age. Yeah, I can just about manage that probably. Yeah. I want to do this for the long term. So how do we do it? How do we energize ourselves? How do we do it so that we're still running at the end of the race? We're not exhausted by the sidelines. So this is some stuff, next set of things just for you to chat about, just for a couple of minutes, then we'll feedback again. What's your experience of that? Do you, like me, have you experienced people who struggle with burnout? We've talked about this a bit in the first session. And then a second question, how do you find this challenge between the balance between your passion, your energy, and the simple physical limits of being human? And we're going to talk about that a bit more in a minute, but take a few minutes to chat about it in your groups, and then we'll come back together. Okay. Anybody want to feedback on that one? Tell me where you're at in your discussions. Have you got anything they want to feedback? Otherwise, I'll just keep talking.
I will be guilty of talking too much. Right, you tell me to shut. The first question, the first question you said was about, do you see other people in the church suffering with burnout?
Yeah.
The answer I came up with was no. The reason why is that if it's twofold. If there are other people burning out in the church, they're burning out because they're as passionate as I am, which therefore means that actually we wouldn't be burning out because we're sharing the load. We find it in our
Good answer. Yeah, I like that.
where we are in our core. I find, from my perspective, it's only 3 people that are really suffering with burnout. That's my core officers and me. My core officers are running absolutely ragged, running the core, and perhaps they're guilty of not delegating enough. That there's not enough strong leaders who are as passionate, as enthused, to take on the roles of church leadership, as it were.
Yeah.
In making a move forward.
The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We all experience that challenge. Yep.
So I'm in this position, and I've got a good future of young leaders coming through. That I said that I almost want to fast forward 5 years, where I can then sit back, let the delegation happen, and happily, watch the harvest come in.
That sounds like a good stage. Yeah. Anybody else? Yep.
I was just going to say, I learned a very simple technique a long time ago from it was a silly sort of time management business course I went on. But one very important thing it taught me was to you have 100% of the day, and never allocate 100% of your day. Allocate roughly 80% of your day, because you'll get phone calls, you'll get last minute emergencies, and lots of other things will happen to fill up that other 20%. If you've already allocated 100% of your day, you're then inducing stress because
Yeah.
it's over your phone.
It's a really good time management tip, isn't it? Don't allocate. I think it's great. However, I'm not disagreeing with that tip at all. I think it's a really good tip. I just know that I tend to allocate at least 100% of my days, most of the time, sometimes a bit more, because I want to push. This is the thing of wanting to push limits. So I agree with you. I think the message is that we have to draw back a little bit. But I think we balance that with there's a tension between that and wanting to push the limits. And I think we do, and I think that's a healthy thing of wanting to push the limits. So sensibly pushing the limits. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a French expression which is called it's reculer pour mieux sauter. It's about if you want to take a bigger jump, you have to take a step back first, basically. And that's kind of what you're saying. I really like their phrase. They're quite sensible people, the French. And that's I really like that phrase, is that often actually if you want to do something better, the first thing you do is to step back and take calm. Yeah, so I think that's good, yeah.
I think my reflection on the balance between the passion and the energy actually is your energy is so key to your passion that you can't separate the two.
Mm.
That actually if you haven't got the energy to outburn your passion, then it doesn't work.
Yes, and that's what that verse in Romans is saying, is that if you lose that energy, you can't be on fire. So you have to prize your energy. You have to place that as a number one priority. Otherwise, you'll lose your passion eventually. Your passion won't hold you long term because it depends on your energy. Yeah, that's completely true. Yes.
I would just say, I'm 50, so I've got to the point now where my passion and my energy don't often match up. But it's finding the things that energize you, knowing your limits. Because I can't do the things I used to. I can't run around the way I used to. But God loves me when I'm relaxed as much as He loves me when I'm running around.
Yeah.
And I find doing the things that energize me, seeing God working in other people, actually just keeps that passion fired.
Yeah, yeah. That sounds good. Yes. Yeah. 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 And yes, and when you do that, the very basic mistake you're making is that you're then trying to do not just your own job, your own calling, but God's. And we don't want God's job. It's very big. The hours are dreadful. The responsibility is huge. So stick to the one that you're given and don't overstep your boundary because you don't want that job soon. But we do often do it, don't we? We overstep it, yeah. Yeah. And we're more prone to that when we're stressed. Let's take one more and then I'll talk a bit more. Yeah, that's very true. That's a really good point. Yeah, and I think that's really important also from the perspective, the church is very often run by people who have a very high capacity for burnout and can pack a lot in. And what you see is a lot of people just don't get involved because they're just too scared. They could never do that. They don't want that for their own lives, so we just put them off. So you're right. I think we have to be very wise about the differences that we all have and respecting of those. And yeah, and each person's different level of energy and also the demands in their life. Because the reality is that you do hit phases in your life where you just can't give as much for whatever reason, whether it's that you yourself has got older, whether it's when you've got younger kids and a lot of your energy is going on them. We're all different. So that's definitely a good point. I think what we're talking about here is going back to a very basic level of just stopping for a second and remembering what we are and who we're created as humans. And there's one of my favorite passages in the Bible thinking about stress is the story of Elijah after he's been on the top of the mountain. And you know the story in 1 Kings where he's had this great big showdown with all the prophets of Baal. And they've been Jezebel and they've been killing all the other prophets and he's literally the only one left. And then he goes and he has this showdown with all these other people on the top of the mountain and has to call down fire from heaven. It's all very dramatic. And it's literally him versus this crowd of hundreds of other crazy, prophet people who are probably quite alarming and quite scary. And it's just him. But he's been incredible. He's stood up to all this stuff. He's been massively spiritual. He's called down fire from heaven. He wiped the floor with them. It's gone really, really well. And then what happens afterwards is that he totally freaks out. He gets home. After this has happened, he's done all of this. He's gone off home. They've all gone off. Ahab gets home. He tells Jezebel all about it, which is going to be an interesting conversation because it's not gone that well. And everything that Elijah's done. And Jezebel, who is quite a feisty lady, sends a message to Elijah. She basically sends him a letter saying, I'm going to get you, basically. It's just, there's not that much strength to it. It's just a bit of a cross letter saying, I'm going to get you. Elijah has just faced this team of baying prophets who were there physically and chanting and doing all this scary stuff. And what happens is that one letter totally floors him. He gets this letter. And he flees. He's afraid. He runs for his life. If you carry on, he goes alone. He retreats into the wilderness, runs away from everything, sits down under a tree and just says, I've had enough. And he prays that he would die. He says, I can't do it anymore. I've had enough. And the contrast between this amazing, spiritually strong guy on the mountain to then this weak, battered guy hiding in the wilderness because of a letter is phenomenal, and to me just paints so strongly what can happen in those moments when our energy has run out. It's had this massive impact on him. And if we look at what happens and how God responds to that, there's some interesting stuff which I'm just going to bring out a bit, just to think about, in terms of how we respond as the church, not just for ourselves, but for other people. Because actually we're working in cultures where burnout is a massive problem. I don't just teach this stuff to the church. I teach it to leaders in all sorts of other environments as well. You know, my husband is a lawyer. He constantly faces this demand between work-life balance, the hours he's expected to work, the energy he's supposed to have, and just the fact that he is realistically a human. So we have to be good at this stuff to support the people we're caring for as well. And an awful lot of what God does for Elijah is about getting back to basics. You know, if someone turned up at your door and said, I've had enough, I want to die, you'd probably want to sit down and have quite a long chat with them, maybe unpack some stuff, get into some deep emotional things, do some praying. None of that happens at first. God doesn't even have a dialogue with him. He sends someone else to minister to him. There's a lot of eating, there's a lot of drinking, and there's a lot of sleeping. It's really back to basics, because at the end of the day, we are human beings, we are physical beings, and we have a physical energy need. A lot of people I work with, their basic problem comes from trying to be super people, when actually they're just human. And I say that to them, and they're really quite disappointed, because I think they were hoping to be super people. Becoming a Christian does not mean that you get the Superman outfit and the cape, much as we would like it. We're still human. Jesus didn't have a Superman costume and a cape either. He was human. He slept. He ate. He had to think about these things because he was human too. So why on earth we think that we're going to be better able to manage than Jesus was, I don't know. Just simple things. How are we eating? How are we sleeping are so important. And I find if I'm getting stressed, almost one of the first things that goes is that I start not sleeping well. And as soon as you're not sleeping well, your physical energy really starts to struggle, and you will very quickly start to fall back. So we have to respect this stuff. Eat, sleep, repeat, eat, sleep, repeat. It's part of the very basic fact of what we're made as humans. We have a rhythm. And if we look at that rhythm, I would say to you, it's more than just saying, well, that's who we are as humans, you know, like it or lump it. We are created in God's image. As humans, something of us, the thing that's amazing when you compare us to the animals is that we alone are created in the image of God. I love the way the message puts it, saying that we are created reflecting the nature of God. When another human looks at you, they see something of a flicker of the reflection of what God is, who God is, what God is like. We act that out every day to the people we interact with. Through us, they see a flicker of the reflection of God, the nature of God. So what do we know about God? We know that God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. There was from the very, very beginning an intrinsic rhythm to the way that God is and to the way that we in God's image are created. And it's a balance between work and rest. And the trick is to do both well. We don't want to become people who we're so scared of burning out that all we do is rest. But also, we need to work. We are called to work. We are created to work. It's a good thing to do. So we want to work well. I see people all the time who've slipped up on both of those. The reality in our 21st century culture is that really what happens is they just tend to get blurred into one. The boundaries aren't so clear anymore. You know, it used to be that you went to work 9 to 5, then you got home and you rested. Now, you know, my husband often says to me, he says, we have little discussions. You have those in a marriage, discussions. We have discussions about my husband's BlackBerry, which he says is wonderful because it means that he's accessible all the time. And I say that it's not wonderful because he's accessible all the time. And when he gets down at mealtimes, or especially if we've gone out on romantic little dinners, I tend to get a little bit stroppy. But, you know, we have discussions. It's a good, healthy part of marriage. But that's the problem, his challenge and my challenge and everyone's challenge, because actually I have my iPhone too and I like to pick up my emails and my messages. Our problem is that the boundaries have become less clear now between work and rest. God seems to know from the very start that the risk with these humans that he's created is that this is the one they'll struggle with. If you look at all the commandments, you'd think the one he'd emphasize more than others would be things like don't murder, you know, the important stuff. Observing the Sabbath comes up again and again and again, that God reiterates it, saying, no, you must. When he sets the people the challenge to build all the Ark of the Covenant and all this stuff, and he gives them a long list of instructions, the next thing he says is, but hang on, you must observe the Sabbath. So what he's saying is, here's a big shed load of work that I need you to do, but you must observe my Sabbath. So he's saying, even though you're really busy and I've just given you loads of really important stuff that you're very passionate about and you have a huge heart for, you must observe my Sabbath. This is so basic to the way we're made that even when God's given us good work to do, we must do our work in 6 days, rest on the seventh. Now, how does that look in the 21st century? Maybe not necessarily 6 days on, 1 day off. A lot of us, we might work shifts or we balance other stuff. But there's that basic rhythm and pattern, and there is something about the proportion there that I think we need to be looking to make sure, not just in our week that we've got a day that is rest and good proper rest, but also in our day that maybe we've got some space in each day where we are getting rest, we're getting time just to think and to catch our breath. We're not superhuman. You know, I've written a book on stress, and the Refuel, the one I've got coming out, is talking about this as well. We have physical limits. If you keep pushing yourself at 110%, you will slip up, either in the short term emotionally or in the long term physically, because your body is not designed to run at that level all the time. We were designed to rest at times. So we're not called to be burned out. You know, I've heard so many leaders, great leaders who are much cleverer and more spiritual than me, preaching, and in the middle of their speech say basically the equivalent of, I want to be burned out for God, and everyone cheers, and I'm going, no, because that's not what we're called to do. I love the passion. Yes, we're called to push the limits and do loads, but we're called to do it in a healthy way. We're called to do it in a measured way. We're called to rest at times. Because we want to do it long term, we're called to finish the race, not burn out 10 miles into it. We're called to finish the race. So if we don't want to do less, which I personally don't, some of you are thinking, I do want to do less. That's fine. Sometimes we have to make good decisions about genuinely doing less. My son's getting to an age where he's needing a little bit less constant attention, so I can do a bit more now. It's nice. But if you need to do less, do less. But if you don't want to do less, you have got to learn how to do rest. Because if you don't, you won't keep going. I push the limits all the time, but I'm very strict about certain things, about what I do. Little rules into my schedule. I never speak 2 weekends in a row. Always 1 weekend on, 1 weekend off. Never, ever. And that is a total, you know, if President Obama asked me to come to the US and speak next weekend, I wouldn't do it because I've said no, and I've agreed it with my family. He was just the first person I could think of who was important. You know, I don't know. I won't do it. I won't do it. I won't do it. It's a rule, and I stick to it. You've got to learn to do it. But it's hard in the church. So what I want you to think about now, how hard do you find it to build those rest times, to build relaxation times? What are the challenges to us about doing that? What are the barriers to it? Do we find it hard, and if so, why? And here's an interesting question. This Sabbath thing, do you regularly keep a Sabbath? How do you do it? What does that look like? I think that's an interesting thing for us to chat about. So let's take another few minutes, and then we'll reflect back about those ones. Just a few minutes, because it's not long till lunch. Okay, sorry, I'm not going to give you very long because, you know, you don't want to be late to lunch or then you will all be stressed out then. So. Anybody got stuff to feed back? How hard do we find it to build rest into our schedules? Yes.
Just discussing the fact that sometimes we dress things up as rest that perhaps aren't.
Oh, I like that point. Tell me more about that.
Well, for us, we can go to church activities, which are on a Saturday, so we take the kids because it'll be fun.
My daughter would really like that point, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so sometimes we dress things up as rest when realistically they're not. Realistically for you, they're work. One of the challenges of being a church leader is that actually it's quite hard to not be being a church leader in a lot of contexts because you're in that position, so you're constantly sort of not totally relaxed, which is very true. Also, we dress other things up as relaxation. So there's a lot of things that we think are very relaxing, but if you think about your brain and your body, they're not relaxing. So a classic one these days is video games, or you know, a lot of people, guys especially, will relax by going and playing video games late into the night. In terms of your brain, that's very stimulating. It's not actually relaxing at all. So it's escapism, yes, but it's not physically relaxing. So we have to watch for things like that and make sure that we're getting it right. Yes?
Picking up on that point, we also dress up what Sabbath is. You know, we go to church, and therefore we are observing Sabbath. But actually, what we do when we're there is so tiring and so
Yeah.
energy sapping that actually we've done the exact opposite.
And it's a slightly weird irony that actually for a lot of us, that day of rest may well not be the day that we're at church because we're working there. It's probably the hardest work day. So you have to build another one into your schedule. Yeah.
There's just not enough time sometimes.
There's just not enough time. I know.
I was just saying, Monday to Friday is my working week. Saturday, my lovely wife would normally have some little jobs that I need to do around the house.
We do that, yeah.
Saturday afternoon, I
So do you back to us, just so you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But Saturday afternoon, I like to play football. But you're not resting. You're running around. I mean, I'm chasing after 18-year-olds. I'm 44 now, and it's. I get back and I'm just pooped. So then Sunday, you've got the youth work, and that's probably our busiest day, of course.
Yeah. And exercise is an interesting one because in some ways it's really good because it raises the levels of endorphins which help you relax afterwards, and it's physically very good for you. But you're right, it's not in the moment physically relaxing. So we have to fit that in, but also we have to fit in.
To do a day, if you like, I would have to say, right, okay, Saturday, I'm never doing football.
And this is, I think, our challenge, which is why we have to think about it and why we have sessions like this, because it's not easy. We have to be very deliberate about how we do it. And people do it lots of different ways. I've heard people say, well, actually, to be honest, what I do is I work, and then I go on retreat for a whole weekend, and I do nothing, and that's like a concentrated Sabbath. Some people, that works for them. We've got to think about how we do it, as long as we do it. Yes?
The moments that I've had that opportunity to sit down and relax, I then, because I am burnt out, I start to question what I'm doing. And actually, I start to feel like, well, actually I'm really struggling, but then I'm not doing a good job. And then I go down this spiral of like depression almost, that
Yeah.
I'm really struggling to try and get out.
And we need to watch for that, because some people, busyness is their way of not having to do something that's actually quite difficult, but that they perhaps need to do. So sometimes if you're like that, that's like your brain telling you, actually, hello, I'm trying to get your attention here all the time. So the minute you stop, your brain is like, oh, thank goodness, let's do this. And you're like, let's not do that. What you need to do in that case is schedule some time to let your brain do some of that stuff, because it needs to have the time.
The question I have is, do you think it's a purely British cultural thing? Because I've got family members that live in Australia and New Zealand, and they are so chilled out, they're almost horizontal. And they're, they've got full-time jobs.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting. I live in France. They're more boundaried about their work culture than we are here. It's not just the Brits. The Americans are bad at it too. I think we have perhaps a bigger struggle with it than some cultures. And there's things that we've lost quicker than other cultures, like clear meal times. We tend to eat on the run. In France, if you eat at your desk, that's like, whoa, that's seriously bad, because you always take a lunch hour. And so there are cultural things there that protect from a lot of this that we've lost. Because I think we have a good energy, and it comes from good places, but we've got to be a bit careful. Let's do one more, yeah.
I was just thinking, how many of us are actually going to take time out from having this weekend as work?
Yes, to balance it, that's true.
Maybe we've all worked maybe Monday, we'll work through this weekend, we'll be back at work Monday again, and we're just going to pile through.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And that is quite a British thing, that. I talk to a lot of people who struggle to take all their holiday, which a lot of people would find slightly bizarre. Why would you not take all your holiday? That's clearly loopy. But actually, I know an awful lot of people who struggle with that. And I speak to a lot of people who will say, oh, yeah, well, I got this new job and it's great because I get an extra 2 weeks holiday. I can't take them, but I get them. And you think, why can't you take them? That's supposed to be a balance between the demands and the responsibility of your job, that you have this holiday time. I struggle with that. I struggle with that too. I think there's a lot here about valuing rest and seeing its importance in order to energize us. My husband is really driven. He loves to be doing things. He always says he must have some kind of input. He can't stand just sitting still. Try and get my husband to sit and watch a film. It's like torturing him, because he's like fidgety. He wants to do something. This is just wasting his time. He can't do it. He's very bad at it. But, he's had to learn to value rest, because he got to, otherwise he's going to burn out. He has to realize that when he's resting, he is doing something. He's doing the most important thing in his week. He's refueling, he's re-energizing, so that he can keep pushing himself as hard as he does. And that's the thing about rest. When you value it more, and when you see God's perspective on it, that he's constantly saying, you must do this, it's really important. That's more of the perspective that we need to have. One thing.
That Liam picked up on earlier on, actually, and we all need to remember this. If, like what happened with you, you suddenly had to stop, the show goes on.
That's really true.
We like to think we're indispensable.
Yeah, that nobody can cope without us. Yes, that's true. I was having that conversation with someone last weekend. It's very true.
If
There's always a way to do it without you.
Exactly. I mean, if you're ill, for instance, and the band has to play without you, they'll find a way.
They will.
You know, and it will.
Even another bass player. They do exist, apparently. We always struggle to find them too, but yeah. It's true. Just a quick one on that, just to say very quickly on illness and stuff. I think we risk falling into a blame culture on this stuff, particularly in the church with stress. You know, I see it happen quite a lot. People get ill, they work very hard, then they get ill, and everyone's like, I see, you were pushing yourself too hard. Oh dear, if you don't stop, your body will make you stop. Do you know, sometimes you just get ill. You just get ill sometimes. We live in a world, there's bugs, sometimes you just get ill. It's not always your fault. Sometimes, yes, if you're getting ill loads of the time, you're really struggling to get over stuff, you know you're exhausted, sometimes your body's trying to tell you something, but sometimes you just get ill. In those moments, yeah, the world goes on without you. Take the time off, otherwise you'll just be ill for longer. And you'll give it to the rest of us by crawling into church anyway. We don't want you here. Go home. But sometimes you're just unlucky, you get ill, you have to take time off because you're ill. Other time you have to take time off because you value it and because you know you need to. And we must set that culture too, you know, as leaders. If I'm always there, if I'm pushing it, if I'm burning myself out, the people who are underneath me, you're talking about young leaders coming up underneath, I need to teach them too to make sensible boundaries, to say no to some stuff, not just to say yes straight away, all this stuff. We're going to finish in like 5 minutes. Just going to pull a couple more things out of this story. This is my French saying. Interesting. Couple of things that are interesting out of the Elijah story. First of all, what happens first? An angel comes to him. God doesn't come in person at first. He sends someone else. He sends a messenger. You know, we are called sometimes to be angels to other people. We are strongest. We're never called to do this ministry thing alone, and that's because we support each other in it. One of you guys was saying that. You know, you work in a team, so support the other people. Sometimes your job in that team is to be the angel to them. I love this verse, talking about us all, the people, as God's people, saying each one will be like a shelter from the wind, a refuge from the storm, streams of water in the desert, and the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. You know, how can we be that to the people we're with? The people in our churches, yes, but also our fellow leaders. You'll see people who are exhausted sometimes, who need some time out. Maybe they're going to find it hard. Help them. Not by saying, oh, if you don't stop, your body will stop you, but help them by being nice. Club together, you know, give them a coffee card so they can go and hang out in the coffee shop. Help them take some time off. Pick up one of their responsibilities. Say, hey, actually, you know, how about next week I run that bit of the group so you can go and have a sit down. You know, don't wait for people to ask because we don't always ask. We need to be angels to each other sometimes and bring them the stuff they need. Second interesting thing, that food, that rest, the physical stuff was what gave Elijah the strength to journey, first of all, to do two things, to meet with God and to do the emotional stuff he needed to do in his own head. When you're really burnt out and exhausted, that is not the time to start trying to unpick your whole emotional self, try to take yourself to pieces. Like you were saying, that guy saying, you know, when you stop, you feel dreadful, you can get into these spirals. If you try and do that stuff when you're exhausted, you will find it very hard to do it positively. So if you want to analyze yourself, take some time out, see how you're responding to the world, do some, you know, read some books, self-help stuff, great, do it. But make sure that you've refueled first. Rest, make sure you're in a good place physically first, because otherwise you'll just end up feeling even worse. It's important to get the rest and to be physically well in order to be able to then address our emotional health if there's some stuff we need to look at. The second thing is that of the importance of that journey is that he didn't meet with God until he'd done that stuff. You know, sometimes when you're exhausted, that's the hardest time to meet with God. And, you know, we're sitting there saying, God, where are you? I so need you in this moment. And God is needing us to journey to meet with him. And our journey is going to be one of resting, of recuperating, of taking time out. And I often speak to people who have burnt out, who've had to take time off work, and they will say, it's just a nightmare. All I'm doing is just sleeping. And then I eat, and then I go back to sleep. And I'm thinking, that's great. Sounds like exactly what you need. And it's so frustrating to be limited by your physicalness as a human. But that's who you are. And sometimes you get to the place where that is part of your journey, just doing nothing for a time, sleeping, resting. It's important in your regular pattern, but it's also sometimes you just get to a point where you have to do that. So the next time you are feeling really lousy, you're feeling really ill, just Relax into that. Sometimes it's exactly what you're supposed to do. Don't be always trying to crawl out of bed, trying to push yourself to get back into work. Just sleep, eat, rest, because that's sometimes just what you're supposed to do. That instinct of wanting to run away, I think, is a very common one. You know, Elijah, he just freaked out and he ran away. An awful lot of us have that in the back of our head, and the more stress we get, you start to get these little flashes of thoughts of maybe if I just ran away and left it all. That is a sign that your brain is stressed out. So if you're getting those flashes of thinking of that, most of us don't ever act on them, but it's a very human thing. And that, even down to the extent of suicidal thoughts, this stuff is a lot more common than we realize because we don't talk about it. But a very high proportion of people certainly have had those thoughts of just wanting to run away from everything and escape. But even down to the end of having, whether they're fleeting or more detailed, longer-term suicidal thoughts, this stuff is more common than we realize. And it's just a sign that your brain is under too much pressure for too long. So don't fear those thoughts, but recognize them as what they are. They are a warning that you need to take some time out. You know, we experience all these dramas. The story goes on, and there's earthquakes and fires and winds. God isn't in any of that stuff. It's the still, small voice in the calm. If we don't create time and space for calm, we risk not ever hearing that still, small voice. If you're so busy caught up in your earthquakes and your winds and your fires and the busyness of your day, that little voice speaking that is God, you could so easily miss it. And I know I've had days before where I'm so busy doing the stuff that feels so important to me that I've done all the ironing and I've cleaned all the floors and I've done all the important stuff and I've written that article and I've planned this talk. I don't know how God ever gets a look in. And I'm supposed to be doing this for my career. This is what I do. If I was doing a normal job and then trying to do all this stuff on the edge, how on earth would I manage? And most of you are trying to do that. So we need to make time for calm and space. I'm going to flick through a bunch of stuff because I just want to get to this point to end on. What does God say to Elijah at the end? Elijah has had basically a fairly significant breakdown. In our culture, if somebody in your leadership team or in your group ran away suddenly, disappeared for a long period of time, sent you messages saying they wanted to die, you'd consider that fairly significant. So he's had a significant breakdown. God doesn't pull him out of ministry and say, oh, you're right, you're too weak, let's leave it, let's call the whole thing off. This is normal. This is about normal human experience. It's not a sign of weakness. We so often think that stress and giving into it is a sign that we're weak or there's something basically wrong with us. This is normal. At the end of the story, what God says is, go back to what I'm calling you to do. We will all probably experience times in our ministry and in our life where we get this stuff wrong, where we maybe experience some degree of burnout, where we have rough times, or when life just challenges us. So what I would say to you, if you've hit those moments, or if you're in one now, it doesn't mean the end. In this race, you can take time out and then come back to the race. That's the great thing of it. You're not just signed off forever. God doesn't say, well, one strike and you're out. Sometimes we'll get this stuff wrong, but he's going to send us back into the battlefield, back into ministry, back to be doing this stuff. But hopefully the next time we'll be that little bit wiser, and we'll keep these boundaries a bit better, and we'll guard our rest a bit better. It's a journey. We're all on it. I know I've had times where I've made mistakes and I've not valued my rest enough, and as a result, things have been harder. So let's keep journeying all together on it, and let's keep listening to God and about the importance of some of the things that we might so easily miss in just how busy we are and how much we want to do. But let's keep passionate, because I like passion, and I think that's really of God. Great. Let's eat lunch, because that would be bad if we left no time for lunch after this session. I'm around if you want to come and chat to me. I think I'm staying for lunch, which is very nice. So come and grab me. Always willing to chat. Tweet me, I'm around. I've got to sit in the car for the rest of the afternoon, so I'm around this afternoon, probably on the end of Twitter, and tomorrow as well. I'm driving back to France, or I'm being driven because my husband will drive. So always happy to get tweets. If you want to get in touch, look on the Mind and Soul website, mindandsoul.info, and find out some more about us and what we're doing on there. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.